Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of Rome in the 1st century CE. The air is thick with the scent of bread just out of the oven, mixed with the sharp tang of iron from the blacksmiths. Merchants shout over each other in the marketplace, hawking fabrics from the east, olive oil from Spain, and wine from Gaul. Behind this chaos, though, is something most ordinary Romans never thought about: the invisible machine that powered this empire, not just its legions or politics, but its technology. Rome's power wasn't only forged with the sword. It was built with roads, aqueducts, cranes, and concrete technologies so advanced that many wouldn't be rediscovered until over 1,000 years later. In fact, when we think of ancient empires, we imagine marble columns and gladiator fights. But if you really want to understand Rome's dominance, you need to see it as a civilization of engineers, not just warriors. Let's start with one of Rome's greatest achievements: its roads. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just poetry, it was a literal truth. At their peak, Roman engineers had built over 400,000 kilometers of roads, more than 80,000 of which were stone-paved highways. To put that into perspective, that's enough to circle the earth 10 times, but these weren't just dirt paths. Roman roads were feats of layered engineering. They began with a trench filled with crushed rock for drainage. On top of that came layers of gravel and sand, and finally, large stone slabs that locked together so tightly some are still intact today, 2 millennia later. These roads allowed Roman legions to march at speeds no other ancient army could match. A messenger carrying orders could cross an entire province in days rather than weeks. And it wasn't just the military merchants, tax collectors, and even ordinary travelers relied on this network. Rome essentially invented the first information superhighway, centuries before telegraphs or the internet. What's fascinating is how standardized the system was. Distances were marked with milestones, the ancient equivalent of highway signs telling travelers how far they were from Rome. In many ways, Rome invented not just roads, but logistics, the science of movement and supply that modern empires would later perfect. Now, picture the city of Rome at its peak. Over 1 million people lived there, something unheard of in the ancient world. How do you supply fresh water to a city that size without modern pumps? For most civilizations, the answer would have been, you don't. For Rome, the answer was aqueducts. Roman engineers mastered the art of moving water over impossible distances. The Aqua Appia, their first aqueduct, was built in 312 BCE. Over the centuries, they added 11 more, some stretching over 50 miles. By the 1st century CE, Rome had enough fresh water pouring in to provide each citizen. With 300 gallons per day, a figure that wouldn't be matched again in Europe until the 20th century. What made aqueducts so genius wasn't just their scale, but their precision. Roman engineers designed them with a near-perfect gradient, often just a few inches of slope per mile. Too steep, and the water would burst the channel. Too flat, and it wouldn't flow at all. They solved this with surveying tools like the chorobates, basically a giant wooden level that allowed them to measure slopes with breathtaking accuracy. And of course, those soaring stone arches you see in pictures of the Pont du Gard in France or the Aqua Claudia in Rome. Those weren't just for show. They allowed aqueducts to cross valleys while maintaining that delicate gradient. Imagine standing under those arches 2,000 years ago, watching a man-made river flow above your head. To ancient eyes, it must have felt like magic. This water didn't just fill fountains and baths, it powered flour mills, fed private homes, and created one of Rome's most underrated luxuries: sanitation. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's giant sewer, was so well designed it's still partially in use today. In an age when most of the world struggled with dirty water, Rome had running taps and flushable toilets. But perhaps the single greatest Roman invention wasn't a machine or a structure, it was a material: concrete. Before Rome, most large buildings were made of stone, cut and stacked by hand. Strong, yes, but limited. Rome's engineers figured out how to mix lime, volcanic ash, and seawater into a material that could be poured into molds, then hardened into something stronger than stone. With concrete, Rome could build at a scale and speed no one else could. The Colosseum, capable of holding 50,000 roaring spectators, was largely made of concrete. The sprawling domes and basilicas that defined Roman architecture were only possible because of this invention. The Pantheon, with its vast dome still standing after nearly 2 millennia, is made of Roman concrete, and here's the kicker. It has never been replicated with the same durability. Modern concrete crumbles within decades if exposed to salt water. Roman concrete, on the other hand, actually gets stronger over time. Recent studies show that when cracks form, the volcanic ash inside reacts with water to essentially heal the structure. Think about that. Rome created a self-healing material. In some ways, their concrete was more advanced than ours today. Now, how did they build these massive monuments with no bulldozers or steel cranes? The Romans were masters of mechanical advantage. They used treadwheel cranes, imagine a giant hamster wheel powered by workers walking inside, to lift blocks weighing several tons. These cranes could multiply human strength by up to 60 times. At construction sites, multiple cranes worked in tandem, orchestrated like the gears of a colossal machine. That's how they lifted the stones of the Colosseum's outer walls, or set the massive obelisks looted from Egypt into place. In some cases, they even designed floating platforms with cranes to move these megaliths by river. What's striking is that many of these machines weren't reinvented until the Middle Ages. The Romans, in effect, had created the blueprint for industrial construction centuries too early. What ties all of this together is foresight. Roman technology wasn't just advanced. It was integrated. Roads connected aqueduct-fed cities. Aqueducts supplied water to bathhouses made of concrete. Concrete allowed for massive public spaces where thousands could gather, keeping the population entertained and loyal. Machines enabled construction on a scale that reinforced imperial power. Rome's genius was that it didn't just invent things, it wove them into a living, breathing system. And that system allowed a single city on the Tiber to grow into an empire that spanned 3 continents. And that's just the beginning. In the next section, we'll dive into Roman military technology, the weapons, armor, and engineering marvels that made their legions unstoppable. Because while aqueducts and roads made Rome livable, it was their war machines that made Rome feared. If roads and aqueducts were the bones and veins of the Roman Empire, then the legions were its fists. And like any fist, what mattered wasn't just strength, it was how you used it. Rome didn't conquer the Mediterranean with sheer numbers. It won because it turned war into science. Every spear, shield, and fortification was part of a carefully engineered system. Let's step into the boots of a Roman soldier and see the technology that made the empire unstoppable. The Roman soldier's weapon of choice wasn't flashy. It wasn't a massive sword like a knight's longsword or a hero's broadsword. It was short, barely 24 inches long, and almost unimpressive to look at. This was the gladius, the blade that built an empire. Unlike the long slashing swords of their enemies, the gladius was designed for stabbing. In the chaos of battle, a Roman soldier didn't need wide swings, he needed precision. Shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, shield in front, he could thrust between the gaps in enemy armor. A few quick, efficient jabs could end a fight far faster than swinging a massive blade. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it worked so well that ancient historians credited the gladius with Rome's dominance. Enemies often mocked its short length, until they found themselves bleeding out from a wound they never saw coming. But the gladius was only half the equation. The other half was the scutum, Rome's iconic rectangular shield. Standing over 4 feet tall and curved to wrap around the body, it was like carrying a personal wall. Individually, the scutum protected a soldier's body, but when used together, it became something greater. Soldiers interlocked their shields to form the testudo, or tortoise formation, a moving fortress of wood and iron. Imagine arrows raining down like a storm, only to bounce harmlessly off a roof of shields. Picture a wall of soldiers advancing step by step, pushing enemies back not with speed, but with inevitability. The scutum wasn't just defense, it was a psychological weapon. To an enemy, seeing an impenetrable block of shields grinding forward must have felt like being swallowed by a machine. Roman armor was another area where engineering trumped brute force. Early soldiers wore chainmail, but by the 1st century CE, Rome introduced the larica segmentata bands of iron plates strapped around the torso. This armor was revolutionary. Unlike heavy, rigid armor, the segmentata was flexible enough for soldiers to move, but strong enough to deflect blows. It distributed weight evenly, so a soldier could fight longer without tiring. Combined with helmets that protected the head while leaving vision clear, Roman armor struck the perfect balance between protection and practicality. Enemies often wore little more than leather or light mail. Against a Roman legionnaire in full segmentata, they were outclassed before the first sword clashed. But Rome didn't just fight battles on open fields. They specialized in taking the untakeable. Enemy fortresses, walled cities, mountain strongholds. How? With siege technology centuries ahead of its time. Take the ballista, a giant crossbow capable of launching bolts the size of spears hundreds of meters with terrifying accuracy. Or the onager, a catapult that hurled stones heavy enough to shatter walls. These weren't just tools of destruction, they were weapons of intimidation. Imagine standing on a city wall, watching massive stones arc through the sky, hearing the crash as masonry explodes around you. And then there were the siege towers, wooden skyscrapers on wheels, covered in wet hides to resist fire, rolled up to enemy walls and unleashed troops from the top straight onto the battlements. Combined with battering rams protected by sheds called testudos, no wall was safe. This wasn't just brute force, it was a carefully orchestrated ballet of engineering. Rome treated sieges like a math problem, applying machines, logistics, and discipline until the enemy broke. What's even more impressive is that Rome didn't just use technology to destroy walls, they used it to build them. A Roman legion on campaign could throw up a fortified camp in a single night. Every fort had a standardized design, a ditch, a rampart, wooden palisades, and gates. Inside, streets were laid out in grids, with tents arranged by rank and function. It wasn't just a campsite, it was a miniature city, defensible and organized, ready to be dismantled and rebuilt the next day if needed. This meant Roman armies could march into enemy territory and never feel exposed. They always slept behind walls, always had supply depots, always had order. No other ancient army moved with this kind of infrastructure on demand. And it wasn't just temporary. Permanent forts dotted the empire's frontiers, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the limes of Germany. Each fort was a hub of roads, storage, and supply. The frontier wasn't just a line, it was a web of Roman engineering projecting power into hostile lands. When we think of Roman power, we often picture legions on land, but the empire's mastery of the seas was just as impressive. During the Punic Wars against Carthage, Rome started with almost no naval experience. Within a decade, they built fleets of quinqueremes, massive war galleys with 5 banks of oars. But here's the genius. Rome didn't just copy Carthaginian ships. They innovated. They added the corvus, a boarding device that turned sea battles into land battles. Picture a spiked bridge slamming down onto an enemy deck, locking the 2 ships together. Suddenly, naval warfare wasn't about ramming and maneuver. It was about hand-to-hand combat, something Roman soldiers excelled at. This single invention flipped the balance of power and allowed Rome to dominate the Mediterranean, turning it into what they proudly called Mare Nostrum, RC. Perhaps Rome's deadliest weapon wasn't even on the battlefield. It was their ability to supply an army across vast distances. Grain ships carried food across the Mediterranean. Road networks delivered weapons and reinforcements at record speed. Armies carried portable forges to repair weapons on the march. This logistics machine meant Rome could fight wars thousands of miles from the capital and still keep their soldiers fed, armed, and paid. Enemies could win a battle. Rome won wars because it could outlast. When you put it all together, Rome's military technology wasn't about single inventions. It was about integration. The gladius and scutum worked with the legion's formations. The siege engines worked with the discipline of engineers and soldiers. The forts worked with the road network that supplied them. Rome wasn't just an empire with advanced tech. It was an empire that treated war like engineering. Every soldier, every machine, every wall was part of a system. And that system rolled over enemies with the inevitability of a storm. But Rome's genius didn't end with roads, aqueducts, or even military might. In the next section, we'll explore the hidden technologies of daily Roman life, from heating systems that warmed their villas to medical tools that look eerily like modern surgery kits, because the Romans weren't just conquerors. They were inventors who built a civilization designed to endure. One of the most jaw-dropping Roman inventions was central heating. The hypocaust system worked by channeling hot air from a furnace into a network of empty spaces beneath raised floors and inside hollow walls. The result? A room that was gently warmed from the ground up. If you've ever walked barefoot on a heated bathroom floor in a luxury hotel, congratulations, you've just had the Roman experience. Except the Romans were doing this 2,000 years ago. The hypocaust wasn't just for villas of the wealthy. It powered the great public baths, massive complexes where Romans soaked, socialized, and conducted business. Imagine steam-filled halls where marble pools glistened under flickering lamplight, the air comfortably warm even on a winter morning. This was more than a convenience, it was a technological statement. Rome was saying, we have mastered fire, running water, flush toilets, public baths. When you list them together, it sounds like the checklist of a modern city. But these were staples of Roman life. Water from aqueducts didn't just go to fountains and villas. It supplied public latrines, where dozens of Romans sat side by side on long marble benches, chatting while water flowed constantly underneath to wash away waste. Crude by our standards, yes, but compared to the rest of the world at the time, it was revolutionary. And then there were lead pipes, which carried water directly into private homes of the wealthy. Some historians debate whether this caused widespread lead poisoning, but either way, the concept of piped water was far ahead of its time. Rome wasn't just keeping its people alive, it was keeping its cities hygienic on a scale unmatched until the 19th century. Step into a Roman military camp or a city infirmary, and you'd find something startling: surgical kits that look eerily familiar. Archaeologists have uncovered scalpels, forceps, bone drills, and even catheters from Roman times, tools not so different from what a modern surgeon would use. The Romans performed cataract surgeries using needles to push clouded lenses aside. They reset broken bones with splints. They even had dental tools for pulling teeth. For an ancient civilization, this level of medical precision is astonishing. Of course, their understanding of germs was non-existent, and infection was a constant danger. But their instruments and procedures laid groundwork that medieval Europe largely forgot and that modern medicine eventually rediscovered. When most people think of the Colosseum, they imagine gladiators battling under the Roman sun. But behind the blood and sand was a masterpiece of entertainment technology. Beneath the arena lay a vast network of underground tunnels, pulleys, and elevators. Animals could be raised into the arena through trapdoors, creating dramatic surprise entrances. Entire stage sets, trees, rocks, even flooded pools could be winched into place to turn the arena into a jungle, a battlefield, or even a miniature sea for mock naval battles. Yes, that's right. The Romans actually flooded the Colosseum for staged ship battles. Imagine sitting in the stands, cheering as gladiators rode miniature galleys and plashed on water, all within the heart of the city. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a flex. The Colosseum was Rome's way of saying, we can control not only man and beast, but nature itself. The Romans also pushed forward technologies we take for granted. Glass windows, Rome had them. They weren't as clear as modern glass, more like cloudy panes, but they let light in while keeping wind out, something no other ancient civilization achieved on a wide scale. They also harnessed water power with mills. In some places, like Barbeagle in southern France, vast complexes of watermills ground grain on an industrial scale, feeding tens of thousands of people. Think about that. While much of the world still ground grain by hand, Rome had factories powered by rivers. And let's not forget Roman roads weren't just for soldiers. They made long-distance trade possible. Goods like Spanish olive oil, Egyptian grain, and silk from China all flowed through Rome thanks to these arteries. The empire was a connected economy centuries before globalization. Another overlooked aspect of Roman tech-driven society: public services. Emperor Augustus created the cohorts vigilum, a corps of firefighters and night watchmen who patrolled the streets of Rome. Equipped with buckets, hooks, and pumps, they were the first organized firefighting force in history. Alongside them were the urban cohorts, something like a police force that kept order in a city of over 1 million. It is a reminder that Rome wasn't just about military engineering or luxury. It was about building a city that could function at scale. We often take for granted the calendar we use today, January through December, leap years, 365 days. But that's Roman innovation. Julius Caesar reformed the chaotic Roman calendar into the Julian calendar, which was so accurate it remained in use for over 1,500 years until the Gregorian update. They also used sundials and water clocks to measure time, and in some villas, complex clepsydras regulated fountains and mechanisms. Rome wasn't just living in the present, it was measuring and structuring it with precision. What stands out about all this technology is how it connected. Aqueducts didn't just provide water, they enabled sanitation, public baths, and heating. Roads didn't just move armies, they created an empire-wide market. Medical tools weren't just for soldiers. They reflected a culture that valued organized, systematic solutions to human problems. In other words, Roman technology wasn't just about flashy inventions. It was about creating a network of systems, civil, military, and social that made life in the empire more advanced than almost anywhere else on Earth. And here's the kicker. When Rome fell, much of this knowledge disappeared. Europe would live without aqueducts, central heating, or massive urban sanitation for over 1,000 years. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Industrial Age that humanity truly caught up to what the Romans had already mastered. Next time you flush a toilet, drive on a paved road, or turn on a heater, you're living with echoes of Rome's genius. Their empire may have collapsed, but their technology still flows beneath our lives, like the aqueducts that once carried rivers through the sky. And that's the incredible story of the advanced tech of the Roman Empire. From self-healing concrete to heated floors, from unstoppable war machines to underground entertainment systems, the Romans weren't just conquerors, they were innovators. Their empire fell, but their inventions became the blueprint for the modern world.